At the 25th BET Awards, Tyler Perry stepped up to the mic with a calm, measured story that sent shock through Hollywood. He didn't mention any names, but the message landed sharply, and the internet instantly knew who he was talking about. The woman who once claimed she was silenced was now being exposed by the man who gave her a voice. This speech peeled back the image Meghan Markle spent years building. The moment Tyler Perry took the stage, the room shifted with eerie silence. And what Perry delivered was a message with grace and precision, directed at someone unnamed. But the audience already knew. He spoke of opening his home to someone in need, of shielding them from public attacks and offering emotional refuge. But he didn't stop there. Perry said, "Some folks borrow blessings like they're owed but never return the favor." Words that cut deep to the casual viewer. It might have sounded like a regular reflection, but to Hollywood insiders, media pundits, and even fans online, it was a bomb. Tyler Perry had just exposed Meghan Markle without saying her name once in the hours after the show. Social media erupted. "He's talking about Meghan," one tweet read. What Perry said wasn't just gossip, it was a confirmation of years of rumored tension, and the silence from Meghan's camp said a lot. No clarification, just the growing realization that Perry's words didn't need elaboration. They spoke for themselves. Rewind to 2020, back when Meghan Markle and Prince Harry were freshly removed from royal duties, hiding from media attacks, and were seemingly abandoned by the institution they once represented. In that chaotic moment, the one man who stepped up was Tyler Perry. Without hesitation, he handed them the keys to his $80 million Beverly Hills mansion. He gave them full security coverage, round-the-clock privacy, and the kind of protection money can't usually buy. At the time, Perry's act was seen as noble. Fans applauded him for offering a sanctuary to two people who, by all appearances, had been cast out. But what the world didn't know was that this generous gesture came with an emotional cost that would haunt him for years. What started as empathy quietly became exploitation. Meghan and Harry weren't just seeking temporary refuge.
According
to multiple insiders close to Perry, they leaned on him for everything in their lives. And at first, he gave without question. Because like many, they were unfairly targeted, misunderstood, and simply in need of help. But generosity has its limits. And behind the scenes, Perry began to notice things that didn't sit right. Gratitude faded, requests increased, boundaries blurred. His home, his resources, even his silence, it all became part of a one-sided situation that no longer felt like friendship. The turning point came when Meghan wanted to borrow Tyler Perry's private jet. On the surface, it sounded like just another favor between friends. But Perry hesitated. This wasn't about convenience anymore, it was about expectations. And when he declined, sources say Meghan didn't take it well. She allegedly lashed out, accusing him of withholding support, questioning his loyalty, and making it clear that a no wasn't something she was used to hearing. That moment, according to insiders, was when everything changed. Perry quietly withdrew, because suddenly what he once thought was a friendship started to feel transactional. The emotional toll of giving and giving, only to be met with entitlement, finally hit. It wasn't just the jet. Staffers in Perry's orbit began voicing concerns. Some had witnessed Meghan's growing demands. Others warned that she had a habit of taking favors, not returning them. They described her as someone who took advantage of generosity and cut ties when people no longer served her. At first, Perry still believed she was under attack, and her motives were pure. But with every demand over gratitude, that belief started to fade. Meanwhile, Harry remained mostly in the background. The dynamic became clear. Meghan made the calls, Meghan shaped the relationship, and Perry began to form some quiet resentment. For months, Tyler Perry was silent. Despite growing frustration and emotional exhaustion, he remained publicly loyal, even as boundaries were being crossed. On one hand, he didn't want to betray someone he had once protected. On the other, he couldn't ignore the truth that his kindness had been manipulated, and his trust taken for granted. But what finally pushed Perry to speak was something far more personal, the realization that his name and his reputation was being used behind the scenes without his consent. In early 2024, word reached him that Meghan had name-dropped him in a pitch meeting, implying he was a silent backer of her newest media project. It was a move Perry hadn't agreed to, hadn't even been informed of. He wasn't just being taken advantage of, he was being leveraged. That's when something snapped when Perry stepped onto that stage at the BET Awards. It wasn't about revenge or drama. It was about protecting his own name, sending a message that even the most generous people have limits. He didn't point fingers. He simply told the story of giving everything to someone who gave nothing back. And Hollywood heard it it loud and clear. Because if Tyler Perry, one of the most respected and reserved figures in the industry, was willing to speak out, you had to wonder how bad things really were behind the scenes. The aftermath of Tyler Perry's speech was immediate. Within hours of the BET Awards airing, Hollywood was filled with curiosity. Producers, executives, and brand reps weren't asking what happened. They already knew. They were asking how deep it went. And Meghan Markle's name had suddenly become a risk. One producer tied to Meghan and Harry's knew. Netflix pitch reportedly backed out the very next morning. Another investor, who had been sitting through development meetings with their team, pulled the plug without a second thought, saying, "I don't want to be involved in something that feels this toxic." And just like that, the business started crumbling. Netflix, which had once poured millions into the Sussexes' media ambitions, began quietly re-evaluating its long-term commitment. Budget reviews were launched. Scheduled hires were paused. Archewell's once buzzing development calendar suddenly was empty. It wasn't about the content, it was about the people behind it. And that Meghan's personal drama was now falling into every professional space she entered. For years, she had walked a fine line between media darling and controversial figure. But Tyler Perry's words changed that entire story. He wasn't a royal insider with a grudge. He was a respected studio head with nothing to gain and everything to lose by going public. That's what made his statement so devastating. It gave others the permission to start distancing themselves too. Suddenly, staying connected to Meghan Markle didn't signal boldness, it signaled risk. And in Hollywood, risk is the kiss of death. Back at Archewell, the panic was immediate. Meghan's team scrambled to get ahead of the fallout, launching what insiders described as a media PR stunt. Their strategy was to reframe the narrative, paint Perry as bitter, out of touch, and maybe even unstable. The goal was to shift public perception before the headlines solidified. But the problem was, it didn't work in the slightest. Exclusive interviews were offered to major outlets. None of them accepted. Behind-the-scenes footage was teased, showing Meghan in real moments of vulnerability and compassion. It fell flat. A podcast rebuttal was brought up, where Meghan would speak candidly about betrayal, female empowerment, and the cost of fame, but it never launched. And the silence that followed only made the public more suspicious. People weren't buying the rebrand this time. Because this story was from Tyler Perry, a man who rarely engages in public feuds, who built his career on empathy and privacy, now calmly stepping forward to say the truth aloud. No matter how Meghan's team tried to spin it, her frantic response only made his quiet truth even louder, even outlets that once rushed to publish. Glowing features about Meghan's resilience and advocacy suddenly turned cautious. One editor reportedly said, "We don't want to look like we're running PR for someone mid-meltdown." And with every failed pitch, every rejected media offer, the damage deepened. The harder Meghan's team pushed, the more people asked, why are they trying so hard to change the story, unless it's actually true? Once Tyler Perry broke his silence, it was like everything was soon to be revealed. Former staffers, assistants, and even collaborators who had once stayed quiet started speaking out. And what they revealed painted Meghan as someone who weaponized loyalty-controlled narratives and ran Archewell like a fortress of fear. One former assistant described working under Meghan as emotionally exhausting, claiming she demanded unwavering devotion and punished those who didn't keep in line. A publicist who once worked alongside her team said journalists were blacklisted for asking unscripted questions. Another insider claimed Meghan frequently dismissed strategic advice, choosing instead to stick to her own version of the story regardless of how unrealistic it was. But perhaps the worst reveal came from Oprah's circle. Once considered close with Meghan, sources revealed that communication between the two women had quietly dried up. No mutual support anymore. When Perry's speech hit the headlines, Oprah, who had once championed Meghan with a popping interview, offered nothing but silence. And in this industry, silence can be louder than any headline. Other producers and consultants echoed the same pattern of control, deflection, and emotional leverage. One said Meghan wanted yes men, not partners. Another described Archewell's internal atmosphere as one where gratitude went to die. These were from people who had been in the room with her themselves, people who had once supported her, and they were all telling the same story. It wasn't bitterness, it wasn't revenge, it was saying it how it is. And as more voices joined in, it became clear that Meghan's inner circle had already collapsed, and Tyler Perry had simply confirmed what too many had been afraid to say. What began as a subtle change in public opinion quickly turned into a full collapse of Meghan's media empire. Brands that once lined up to work with her were now quietly backing away. One by one, potential collaborators went silent. Meghan's name, once a buzzy headline guarantee, had become a potential hazard in boardrooms and pitch meetings. Inside Archewell, things were collapsing. Projects were put on indefinite hold. Employee hires were cancelled, and previously in-progress initiatives were now under intense budget cuts. Sources close to the foundation admitted that the atmosphere had changed dramatically. What was once a place of purpose-driven optimism now felt like one of stress and damage control. Meanwhile, social media had turned sharply against her, portraying her as entitled and disingenuous. Influencers who once posted supportive content had gone quiet. Even fan pages started questioning how much of Meghan's narrative had been real and how much had been perfectly displayed fiction to the public. This was more than just a scandal. Meghan had built an entire brand on being silenced by the royal family, on being the brave outsider fighting against a cold institution. But now the people pulling back the curtain weren't palace officials or royal members. They were her own allies, Hollywood powerhouses, creative partners, and former staff. And their stories didn't align with the version of Meghan the world had been shown. And through all the chaos, one person remained noticeably silent: Prince Harry. While Meghan fired off damage control strategies and panicked responses, Harry's voice was nowhere to be found. Insiders say he was overwhelmed, exhausted, and emotionally done. Years of royal separation, media wars, and now watching their inner circle fall apart had taken its toll on him. Some believe he was trying to salvage what little remained of their public image. Others say he simply gave up, and that silence didn't go unnoticed. In fact, it deepened what was forming. Meghan was the one pulling the strings, while Harry faded further into the background. And with every unspoken word, the image of unity they had carefully created began to fall. Tyler Perry's speech wasn't loud or angry. It was honest, calm, and precise. And that's exactly what made it so harsh. He exposed a pattern, a repeated behavior of entitlement, emotional manipulation, and offense once the favors stopped flowing. And he wasn't alone in feeling used. He was just the first to say it out loud. In Hollywood, reputation is everything. And when someone like Perry, a studio-owning mogul, decides to publicly pull back, it makes a path for others to follow. Meghan Markle had already been cut off from the crown. Now, she was being quietly pushed out of the very industry that once welcomed her. With open arms, the fairy tale of their life hadn't just ended. It had been broken completely. Tyler Perry didn't need to name names. He didn't need to shout. All it took was one carefully chosen phrase, and the illusion began to crack. And in an industry built on silence, his honesty hit hard. What followed wasn't just a PR crisis, it was a collapse of trust. Meghan Markle had once positioned herself as a survivor of royal cruelty. But when her own allies started stepping back, the question changed from why was she silenced to who did the silencing all along. And in that change, the public saw a woman not just fighting with the crown, but now cancelled from the culture she thought she once controlled.